All righty. We're going to pull up our slide here. So we're going to go ahead and share with you the purpose of the project. We'll be going through some slides for that. We also want you to meet our lovely project team, many individuals here who are behind the scenes working on this project, but also who you may know and who may be colleagues of yours who are helping support this project. And then the most important thing is we are going to be having you share your stories and your insights on the couple of questions we're going to be asking that will help guide this project. And then we're also going to share with you just next steps in the project and what we'll be doing so you have a sense of, after you log off, what happens next with the project. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer Chenoweth from Austin Parks and Recreation Department. She's the museum site coordinator, so she can go ahead and give you a sense of the purpose of the project and to introduce the team. Jennifer?
Hello, my name is Jennifer Chenoweth, and I am the museum site coordinator for the Oakwood Cemetery Chapel. And I work for the Museums and Cultural Programs Division for Parks and Recreation Department for the City of Austin. The chapel sits within the historic colored grounds at Oakwood Cemetery. It was built in 1914, and if you all have kept up with our project, it was built on top of graves in the Jim Crow era. And the historic colored grounds are about 3 acres as we understand it now. And I'll show you another picture in a few minutes. But the picture you're looking at right now helps tell the story of the cemetery as in one image, the best I can get to you right now. This is the bird's eye view image of Austin in 1873. And in 1870 census, there were 4,428 people living in Austin. This orthogonal grid of Austin that you see is 1.96 square miles. And it goes to basically what we know as the north boundary of Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard and the south boundary is the river. The east boundary would have been East Avenue, and the west boundary would have been, I guess it's not quite Lamar, it's Guadalupe, or I think maybe it's just a bit past, but where that creek runs into the river is about where the Central Library is, which is where one of the first white settlements was in Austin, just in the 1830s. So this was after the Civil War and just after the train started arriving to Austin from Houston. The red line is the boundary of what the cemetery would have been at that time, which would have been about 4 acres of what we call the old grounds and a little bit of what we would call the historic colored grounds. And then the blue line is an approximation of the 40 acres it had grown to by 1912. Now there's even further east is the Oakwood Cemetery Annex, which is another 18 acres. But as the city grew, the cemetery grew. And what we're trying to understand are the lives of the people buried there and the conditions that existed in the lives of these people that also affected how they were treated in death and how they were buried and whether or not they were written down in the record books or if their death certificates were even noted in any doctor's medical records. So what we're trying to do with this project is explain the history of Austin in this 3D digital model. So what you're looking at isn't just an aerial photograph. This is a screenshot out of Google Earth. And Google Earth is the most commonly understood or experienced for most people 3D model. The trees are a little patchy. Everything's got a lack of detail. The resolution goes in only so close, but you can create very high resolution 3D models with some other types of software that can get added into this type of thing. Along with Google Earth, Google Maps also cross-references all the place-based information that Google Maps has in it so that you can search up a street address or a little bit of information about a business or a place as you use Google Earth. But we are trying to really geolocate every bit of information we can find about these people to the location of their grave. And if you have over at least 2,700 African Americans buried in this section and probably 1,000 more other people, how do we visualize this for the community and for potential descendants to understand this place as an African American burial ground of people who were brought to Texas enslaved in their lifetimes, and often who died while enslaved? Some of the people went on to become emancipated and live other lives and substantially contribute to Austin, not just as ordinary whatever people, but some as rather impressive historic people. And some in their labor and their ordinariness created a legacy of, in their culture, of love and determination and decency that should be a model for us all. And I've learned a lot about researching these people's lives, and I have a lot more to learn with your help. So we've created a design for a database of information for any information we can come through with genealogy research or rooting through digital archives and physical archives for photos or records about people. And there's more a lot more work to be done, but the purpose of this conversation is to ask you to contribute to what you would envision for this project. And with that, I'm really grateful for the help of our colleagues. So I work with Greg Farrar, who works at the Oakwood Cemetery Chapel, but I got the pleasure of meeting him as he visited with his family to find his ancestors. His great-great-grandfather is Reuben Shannon Lovingood, who was a classics professor who was born right at the end of the Civil War in the South and came to Texas to be a professor. And he was brought to Austin as an invitation to be the first president of Samuel Houston College, and his legacy is substantial and deeply inspiring. And it's through Greg's voice as a descendant, but also as a staff member, that we can really focus on this work, because we have his representation and we can help try and do some justice to these people. I'm going to briefly introduce our fabulous colleagues who will be participating in this conversation a lot more than I will be. And that you've met Dr. Laura Cortez. She's our communications expert, but she's not just an expert in communication. She's got a fabulous point of view in environmentalism, science, business, and education. Dr. Maria Franklin is a professor at the University of Texas at Austin in African diaspora and archaeology anthropology. She served as our archaeologist consultant for the All Together Here project and symposium, and I learned so much about archaeology from her and hope to learn much more from her in this project. Dr. Tara Dudley, I met when she was visiting the cemetery, also in search of an African-American stonemason who's buried there, who material helped build Austin. And I've been working on trying to find ways to pay her for her excellent work since. And I'm really grateful to have this opportunity. Diana Hernandez has just finished her master's degree at UT, also in historic preservation, which is what Dr. Dudley teaches at the University of Texas School of Architecture. And Diana is really studying Mexican-American cemeteries, preservation, and cultural heritage as a really unique voice in Austin. And I look forward to hearing what you all bring to this conversation. If there's anything else factually I can answer for you about the projects, I'm happy to do so. But really, the conversation is all about you all.
Thank you, Jennifer. And before we begin, we like to always give our project team a little opportunity to say hello to everyone. So I'll just turn it over to them real quickly, just so they can have a couple of words.
Good morning.
Hey, everyone. Oh, go ahead.
Joining us. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead. You're good.
Thank you for joining us. We're really looking forward to the conversation and to having your expertise, also as subject matter experts in preservation and history. And we just really look forward to your contributions this morning. So we are grateful for you taking time out on a Friday morning.
Definitely. Thank you all for being here, and I'm grateful to be able to just listen and to learn and to hear, and to let the subject matter experts tell us what they know. So thanks for being here.
Yep. Thank you for coming. Jenny, it's good to see you again. Looking forward to hearing what you both have to say today.
Good morning. I just want to say hello to familiar faces here in the chat, Jenny and Steph. Good to see y'all. And looking forward to seeing what everyone else has to say. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. So we're going to get started. We always believe that we have to begin by starting where we come from and with some of our history. And so while you are very familiar faces to many of us, sometimes maybe we haven't asked you the question as to where you were born or when did you come to Austin and those types of things. So we're just going to start by having a small icebreaker and having you share a little bit your name, your affiliation, or organization you're representing today. And then where were you born and when did you come to Austin?
Steph, is it you or I who goes first? You or me who goes first?
I'll go first.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Steph McDougall. I am talking to you today from Houston. I am in League City, just about halfway between Houston and Galveston. I'm from Ohio, Tip City, Ohio, the occupied lands of the Shawnee. And I am a historic preservation consultant and worked on the cemetery vision plan for the city of Austin back in 2014 and 2015.
Wonderful. Thank you for being here, Steph. Jenny?
My name is Jenny McWilliams. I was born in Ann Arbor, Michigan, but I got here when I was 2, so I have no memories of that former place. I grew up in College Station, Texas, the daughter of university professor and biologist, so very much academia, running around on campuses, both A&M and UT was just sort of a weekend event. And I have a background in archaeology. I worked in Central and South America. I worked in Texas for about 15 years. And then came to what I call my early retirement, which is the Texas Historical Commission, where I get to sit in the air conditioning in a chair all day long with no barbed wire fences, and really learned a lot about cemeteries. I had previously been working in cemeteries to excavate the remains and remove the remains for construction projects, TxDOT, large lignite mines where they move hundreds of burials into one central cemetery that represents an entire almost county of little small communities. And so I now try to keep the burials in the ground rather than excavating them. So.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jenny and Steph. So we appreciate having that background and knowledge, and we know this conversation is probably going to be extremely rich. And so we are going to share with you just the 3 guiding questions that we're here for this project to kind of explore. And I'm just going to share a quick slide with you. As we were speaking with Jennifer and preparing this small group presentation, she started thinking through her mind as being the grant writer and working with her team and thinking through many times we can start from different aspects and gathering information. But she said, you know, if we fast forward 100 years from now, how do you believe this story should be told? And we believe this project is going to continue expanding just in our conversations from one focus group, but we have to start somewhere. So our questions are going to be around, how do you believe this story should be told? When we have descendants, we never know, there are unmarked and unnamed. And so we are finding that some folks may say, I don't know if I'm a descendant yet, but maybe them thinking about the how they want their families to be learned about. And then the next question is, what information should be contained in this story? These are large, big questions, but the how and what information should be contained, and then what lens should the stories be told? And so we're going to pretty much turn off our mics here and let you begin the conversation. And you can start from whichever question you like. I will do my best to put maybe them in the chat so that you could just refer to them and take a look. And then, of course, we'll have dialogue with folks that are on here as well. But maybe just thinking, as we invited you to this project, how do you believe the story should be told? Or based on your background and expertise, where do you think we should begin?
I'm just going to jump in with some ideas just to sort of start talking. When I'm going to start with the chapel project, because that's really where I got involved, or I had a sideline to be involved, and that chapel project was heartbreaking to me. And the reason it was heartbreaking to me is because I realized we really had not moved very far. That when I said, why don't we take down the chapel, that was literally laughed at. And I thought that chapel has now twice taken over the space of human burials. Not only the first time when it was built over their original burials, but when they knew there were burials, it was still more important to have a chapel than the burials. And I encouraged them to do remote sensing, to outside, to see the lines, that yes, these lines continue into underneath. No, nobody would build a chapel over these burials. Oh, look, they did. Well, let's just move them. So I just couldn't believe that there wasn't even a conversation that with the chapel was more important than the burials. I also want to bring up, and I don't think any of this is on topic exactly. I'm just talking about my experiences with Oakwood. That I hear the voice of Dale Flatt often, who says that this is not the African-American burial ground. I'm just bringing that into the conversation. I'm not saying it is or isn't, but that Pauper's Fields is a very common term. It does include, it's more inclusive of all other groups, and I don't know the numbers, so I'm just voicing that there are other ethnicities buried there. That's all. As far as how should the story be told and what information should be contained in the story, I need to let that simmer a little bit. I feel like I'm not quite ready to. I need some more ideas coming at me.
Well, I'll jump in and say that if you look at the historic maps, to echo a little bit of what Jenny just said, what was identified on those early maps as the colored burying ground was much smaller than what I think gets included in that today. And certainly, that could have expanded over time. Maps, of course, only reflect what is happening at that time. But I do think that there is like Jenny said, there's not a definitive understanding of who's buried where. And in addition, until 1848, with the treaties signed after the Mexican War, Hispanic people, that's when Hispanic people officially became considered white in Texas. So, we don't know who exactly was classified as colored in between 1839 and 1848. I mean, there could have been Mexican people that were listed as colored in the records at that time too. So I don't want to take away anything from the African-American people who are buried there, certainly. But I do believe that it is a complex story. And I think that as humans, we are very uncomfortable with complexity. We want the story to be simple and tie a bow on it at the end, and then we're done. And so I just encourage everyone involved in this project to challenge that and to resist the impulse to try to simplify the story here. The other thing that I would say about, what story do we tell and how do we tell it? I don't believe that that's something that I, as a white Anglo person, should be answering. I think that has to be completely community driven. And I appreciate the opportunity to, be involved in this focus group. But I would not be comfortable providing direction. I think the direction I would provide is the community needs to be the ones who decide how the story is told, not a bunch of professionals. And I know that the city of Austin has been doing community engagement around this and has been working closely with people like former council member Houston on this since the discovery, official discovery was made in the ground. But I don't think you can do enough community engagement on a project like this. I mean, there's never a point where you say, check that box, now we're done. I'm just not comfortable answering those questions.
Is there something else here we could explore? And I think that, we started much of our other conversations in the same way. It's a complex story, but is there, and I'll ask maybe our project team, or is there something that now that we have these colleagues here, wonderful colleagues who have these insights, is there something else we could explore together while we have this time here?
I know that I can try to add some context in terms of numbers. I know that for just going through the database and what we have on our spreadsheet. So for basically the people that they deemed as being buried in the colored ground, of those around roughly 2,700, 2,000, up to 2,000 of those records are prior to 1900. So the bulk of the people that are buried there were actually buried before 1900, with a couple hundred post 1900. So hopefully that kind of gives a little bit of context as far as the spread of the data, and I can kind of go deeper just depending on what questions anyone has.
I think one of the other concerns that I have about making decisions about telling the stories of individuals is privacy, and how descendants may or may not want that information to be shared, particularly if that's information that they didn't necessarily have before and may not have had time to process. So I'm working with a African-American cemetery over in Chattanooga right now, because I'm in a public history PhD program. This is one of my assistantship projects, and the two families that have in series owned this cemetery since 1904 really don't have a lot of information about it. And we're preparing a National Register nomination, and I think it's a very delicate dance in terms of how you excavate data from your research to tell the story of this place. And with the collaboration of family members, and in this case, it's, two families. That's, pretty easy because we, know who we are, who they are, and we're in contact with them and that sort of thing. But, there's information that clearly, I'm finding that I'm not going to put in the nomination because it's private information. So I'm just really concerned when you start talking about, 2,700 people and trying to tell stories of individuals, how their descendants are involved in the process of deciding, what they're comfortable with you sharing. And again, I think that has to be driven by the community. That can't be something that's the city of Austin makes decisions about without having really a policy for how you're going to approach that.
That's really interesting, Steph. I think, and it's going to be individual, and it's not going to be across the board. In so many phone calls I get from the public, it's families fighting with families about what they want to happen to their cemetery, the future of their cemetery, the organization of the cemetery association. It's not clean. It's emotional. Obviously, y'all are working with this, surrounded by this, but there's just not agreement with everybody's different. Everybody has a different story and some stories, they'll want to highlight and bring to light and celebrate. And some stories might be too personal or too complex, or a divorce in a second family, or there's a lot of scenarios that's we don't want that story told, or we're embarrassed by that story, or our father never told us that story, or whatever.
Yeah, I think for me, for example, in this Chattanooga situation, I'm working with the grandchildren of the guy who bought it in 1904. He'd had a second family after his wife died. And so they're the children of the very youngest son who only recently passed away, but they don't have any information about their grandparents, that line was severed. So, and then the other family that owned the cemetery, we don't have any clear ownership evidence because of heirship, transfers. It's super, super complicated. And in that family also, they said, well, we don't have records because there were problems with wills and arguments in the family about, who got the cemetery. So I think, the other issue that I am really, really concerned about is the tendency, and this is not a ding on Save Austin Cemeteries, but I'm very uncomfortable with tourism-based activities like the Murder and Mayhem Tour that involve enslaved people. And that is something that happens at a lot of cemeteries where they, lump that in with, murders and, sensational cases. And then there will be, someone who was enslaved. And I just really do not want to see that kind of voyeuristic tourism extended to individual graves in Oakwood, in the African-American burials area, or to the graves of the people who were disinterred from under the chapel and reinterred in Oakwood. I think it's just so problematic. And the people who are, setting up these tours and going on these tours are not the community members. It's not the descendant diaspora right? It's white folks who are, doing this, and sometimes with very good intentions, sometimes as a business. And I just think it's super disrespectful. And I'm really uncomfortable about how the information that's generated through this project becomes used by people who would not be respectful to the people that, are buried there. So, that's I think the other issue that, I see happening. And I think SAC has, not done, any kind of, quote unquote slave grave, reenactor in their murder and mayhem tour, but that's not to say that someone else wouldn't. And so how the information that you're finding is used and treated and stewarded, I think, is a concern.
I'm not sure how to address that stuff as an archaeologist. I produce stuff, it gets out there, it's in an article, it's posted on the internet. I can't police that. So I'm just wondering what suggestion you might have for how the city might proactively try to prevent things like cemetery tours. But I don't know that as a researcher that I have to, I can't operate out of fear that someone would use my information in ways that I didn't intend, because then it also prohibits me sharing and disseminating that research to people who actually have very good intentions. And for the most part, that's generally who's seeking stuff that I do.
Dr. Franklin, I understand that, and I agree with you entirely. I wouldn't suggest that you should have to censor yourself or, not publish that, information that you find. My concern is just that the city has a policy for how it shares information and who it shares it with. So, if Jennifer and the project team are creating this database of, of people and information, does everything become publicly available? Is it limited? If it's limited, how is it limited? I'm not saying that any of that should be censored. I think that but I think that there needs to be some community participation in making decisions about how that information and what comes out of it is manifested, in the cemetery itself. So, as a researcher and a scholar, I want all the data, right? I want access to everything so that I can poke around in there and find out what the story is and how to tell it for whatever project I'm working on. And that's not to say that, my motives are pure and nobody else's are, because my motives are never pure. I always have, like all kinds of ulterior motives for what I want to do too. So, but I think there should be some kind of forethought and policy decisions made ahead of time to the best of the city's ability in terms of what access, the general public is going to have to some of this information. And what they're going to allow in the cemetery in terms of for example, for-profit tourism. Is there something that they will where they're going to require registration, for example, like in New Orleans, I believe that the cemetery tour companies have to be registered with the city, for example, and those tours have to be approved. So I think there are ways that you can, try to safeguard some of the use of the information in terms of how it's presented. I'm not saying you shouldn't have access to it and shouldn't be able to use it for scholarly purposes, of course.
One other question, folks have been, thank you for that, Steph. I appreciate that. And I agree that the city needs to think of these things ahead of time and not be reactive, but proactive. And I think the registration, I don't know what tours go through. That is something maybe Parks and Rec should think about, is like whether they, want to have some kind of permitting process in place if they don't already. But another question that I had was about community. Who is the community that should drive the questions? I mean, we met with folks that I would consider descendants, this week already. We've got upcoming meetings with them, but I'm just trying to think about, maybe you have alternative ways to figuring that, identifying that group.
Well, I think that's the really tricky question, right? I think that, I've been involved in a situation in Florida where unmarked remains were discovered, and their state law says that if the family can't be located, that the community of origin gets to decide, what happens to those remains, how they're, where they're reinterred, how they're reinterred, if they're, some kind of ceremony or whatever. And I think that's, that's a good option, good practice. The question is, what's the community of origin, the surrounding community? Do you go to Pflugerville and say, hey, everybody that moved here from East Austin, will you participate? I think it's easy for me to say the net that is cast has to be very wide, because I'm not the one doing that work. And although my superpower, which is not at all secret, is thinking up work for other people to do and then making it as complicated as possible, I recognize that, and you all know that's true if you know me. I recognize that it's easy to say, well, you have to contact everybody and cast a wide net and do your due diligence, but it's not like there's a monolithic Black community in Austin, so or that it has remained the same over time. So I don't know the answer to that question. I think that, I think that this is another situation where the community should be telling you what that means, and reaching out and having these focus groups and asking people who are from East Austin, who grew up there, elders and pastors and community leaders and the folks at Houston Tillotson and other institutions in East Austin, and asking where, and of course in other places where people refuse to be relocated into East Austin, right, like Clarksville. So I think that they're the ones who should tell you what the community means in this scenario.
Jenny, thank you. Jenny, do you have some ideas around that?
Well, I mean, just listening to Steph talk, I was sort of teetering back and forth between the excitement and energy that that I felt when Jennifer started the database and the research, and basically that Jennifer had all of this stuff that she needed to organize, and then what to do with it, and then what to do with it, and then how to make it public, and all of that. And so that this project seems like it's going so far above and beyond what so many other cemeteries in the US are even touching. And that's exciting to me. That's like the grand plan, like that's amazing. But and then hearing a little bit about, oh wait, we've got to hold that back, and hearing a story that my father told me. He has a friend he met very casually in line at a barbecue restaurant, Mr. Love, who's an African-American man, and they got to be friends and talking, and my dad said one day, my dad's asking him these questions about history in Brazos County and African Americans living there, and And Mr. Love said, well, Eddie, you're asking me you're asking me to tell you stories of things I wanted to forget. You know, you're digging up this stuff. And that was before. And so I think there's a part of diaspora that is moving on, that is leaving behind, to not go back to that place, to not go back to that mental way of life. And it's not mine to decide at all. like Steph said, that's not my story. That's not my choice. You know, my father was kind of picking a little too hard at Mr. Love. And so I'm a little bit going back and forth. And with the tours, when I first came into cemetery preservation, I hated the tours, hated them. I thought they were cheap and gimmicky, but I went on some, and you know what? Now I know that house is where that woman lived, and I have sort of an idea of her and her life, and that her father owned this other building, and that was a mercantile, and I have this picture now. Every time I drive through that town, I think of it differently than I did before the tour. Could I do that tour to an African-American community? No. Can white people do it for the white burials in theirs? I think so now, when I didn't before. So that was a learning curve for me. I'm not really sure I'm diving as deeply into this, but I do know that it's going to be hard to decide what to share and what not to share. That I do know.
Well, Steph brought up a point about colored meaning a number of things for a certain period of time. And we already, you know, I mean, we suspect, I mean, the bioarc is suggesting that there were people, you know, Mexican descent, whites, blacks. DNA analysis will help to clear much of that up, I think, if the sampling was good, but we'll see. So community is obviously more than the Black folks. I mean, that's stuff, that was the first thing that you said, is that we have to, and of course, the people that we've been talking to are not just Black. But in order to sort of like, I mean, I know it's complicated, but you guys are the experts, which is why we're talking to you. So there are going to be people who didn't even want the burials disinterred. I mean, we already know that. I mean, there are people who are strongly even against that. There were people who don't want any of this information probably published. You know, they're reburied, leave them in peace. But we do need to have a basis for, I mean, I think, yes, talking to East Austin residents, absolutely. Talking to people whose ancestors that, you know, are known to be buried at the cemetery, like Greg, absolutely. Some of these are kind of no-brainers. Casting a wide net, I guess that is up to the city, who has had at least a track record of reaching out to different folks since all of this started. And, you know, so I think folks have been trying, at least. Where do we go from here, though? I mean, do we do a snowball method? Do we talk? So, I mean, Steph, should we just maybe ask these folks that maybe didn't want to be part of a focus group, but go back to those folks and say, hey, can you give us some other names of people who might not even be here anymore? They might have moved to Pflugerville, or, you know, are there some other folks that we can contact?
Yeah, I think that at this point, you know, this seems to me to be, you know, kind of a rolling and phased project. And I think if I were involved in the project team, and not knowing exactly, what all you have, have completed and is still to do. I think it's always useful to get to a point and do a really deep examination of what you do have and what you think you still need, and then make a plan to try to, go forward looking for that stuff. And I know I'm not telling you anything that you have not already thought of. But I think at this point, you probably have a good idea of how responsive community members have been to your solicitation of participation. You probably have a good idea of what's worked and what's not. A little bit of this is marketing, right? You're going to, try something, and then, when it doesn't work very well, you can tweak it and try something else. I think probably for me, the biggest thing would be to document, and I'm sure you're already doing this too, document everything that has been done, and then go back and look and see, are there any gaps? Are there people or who we, maybe we got their names and we missed talking to them. But I think, I always, when I talk to members of the community for projects, the last question I always ask is, who else should I be talking to, and can you introduce me? And I'm sure you're doing that too, right? So, I mean, it's not like, everybody here is, a smart person who's really good at their job. But I think that the real question is, what's your goal? At what point will you say we have succeeded and then we're done? And I'm not sure from, having, I moderated a session and all together here, and obviously, have been involved with, this since before the, on the periphery, but since before, a shovel went in the ground under the chapel. I'm working on stuff for Plummer's Cemetery right now, also as part of my doctoral program. The question for me would be, how will you know when you're done? How will you know when you've succeeded? And I think that maybe this is the time to figure that out, because then you can look at where you are right now and where that goal line is, and figure out how, what you're going to need to do to get from point A to point B. And I don't know what the answer is to that. I think, I think it's great to have a database. It's great to make it accessible. Certainly, I think that's maybe an endpoint for this phase of work, to say, we've dug up everything we can, right now, and put it into a database, and maybe now we're going to see what kind of inquiries we get. But or come up with ideas for how we can use it. What's our interpretive plan for this? What is the interpretive strategy for telling a greater story? If you haven't developed an interpretive strategy yet, I think that would certainly be something, but you've probably already done that. So I don't know. I think it's hard to figure out what direction you want to go in and what you want to do next if you don't know where the goal line is. That's probably not helpful, but that's what I've got.
No, it's helpful, and it's always good to talk to other researchers about where, even if you're like saying some of the things that that Jennifer's already kind of decided about the project and just, consulted with us about. And it aligns with what you're saying. It's like, oh, great. Okay. Yeah, we're on the right. It's good to get confirmation. And then when you say, have you thought about this? And it's like, oh, we need to go back and like sit down and have that conversation. I mean, yeah, you could always talk to more people. To me, in that sense, the process is ongoing, because I did this oral history project back in 2010. And just 2 years ago, one of them came to me and said, hey, my aunt is in her 90s now. She regrets saying no to you when you asked her for an oral history. Can you come and do this oral history? You know, I'm like going, where did I put that recorder? You know, so now I've got this other oral history. I mean, it's just never ending. I still talk to those folks. And so I see this as it will likely grow, right? I don't know that it'll take on a life of its own. I mean, it's under Jennifer's, you know, mastery, and Greg will be there and guiding it. But I think there's always going to be people coming forward saying, hey, I know who that person is, or I want to let you know that you did a really shaky job on that part. And I want, you know, so I just don't think that I think we do have to have a goal saying that this is the end, because we all have to part ways at some point and move on, you know. But I think that saying that it's closed off completely from further changes, I think that that's where you have to say, no, you know, we've got responsibilities to make sure that this is still open to change and transform. And to make it so that it is able to gather new information, include more people.
And I know that the city has a commitment to stewarding that information into the future too. I guess one of the other questions I'd have is, you know, what about when people come and say, I don't know about my family, you know, can you help me, you know, figure out if I have a connection here? You know, what's the process going to be to, you know, responding to those people where, you know, I can anticipate that could be, you know, a lot of time, you know, required for staff. And, you know, how, you know, I'm thinking from a process standpoint, I think that, you know, to the extent that the city can come up with replicable, realistic and reasonable processes for, you know, how to deal with, not deal with, but, you know, how to handle common inquiries would probably be really helpful. Not only because, you know, then you'd have a plan of attack for when those come in, but also so that, you know, everything is not dependent on, you know, Jennifer or Greg's institutional knowledge, you know, especially when from a stewardship standpoint going forward, you know, at some point, you know, they will move on in some way. And so how do you make sure that institutional knowledge doesn't leave with those individuals? I think that's a huge issue for a number of organizations, for most organizations, really. And it's something that we could be capturing from the beginning and building, you know, more of a foundation for, you know, departures whenever those happen. And we never do it, right? No organization ever does it because it's not what's on fire in front of us right now. And then we get to the end and somebody's been there for 10 or 15 years and they, you know, take a different position or, you know, have a health issue or whatever and have to leave, or, you know, a personal change. And then we panic because, you know, all of that institutional knowledge walks out the door. So that's the other thing I think, you know, I would be encouraging the city to do right now is, you know, to make time in the schedules of people who are amassing this knowledge to capture it so that it's available to other folks later.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
I think that longevity, that looking forward is really important. I think when a person comes and asks for help and research, that's an opportunity to ask for permissions and what can be shared, but that one person does not represent the 200 descendants of who they're researching. So that's where I just actually wrote down the word health and safety code, because the health and safety code provides a listing of who can tell you when to move a burial. Now, do you use that to say who can tell you what to share? I don't know, but there needs to be sort of a tree that just because we got permission from this person, how far do you take it? I mean, it's that permissions thing kind of made my head explode a little bit. Let's see, I had
Well,
another.
we ran into that with the cemetery vision plan, where we were trying to figure out the legal ramifications of the city repairing collapsed brick tombs or crypts, right? And there's no good case law for how to decide who owns that, 100-year-old, grave at this point, because, airship has been diluted so much over that period of time. How do you decide who gets to speak for the person who is buried there? And at what point is that burial the burial so deteriorated that the city has the ability to step in and make repairs? I think we deal with this in a lot of cities that are responsible for graves. And I can tell you that I talked to a lot of legal experts, and they were like, we really don't have a good answer for you. So I think, and that's with, sunken, deteriorating graves where you have the threat of visible human remains. That's certainly something where you would think there would be, precedent, and we don't even have that. So,
At the very least, a safety clause.
yes, right. And what qualifies. So if we don't even have, concurrence on that, I think the question of who gets to speak, for permission about the information about this person is certainly even less clear.
Oh, I want to maybe turn this just a little bit. I had a question about the names of the people that we do know. I realize we don't know a lot of the names, and what's in a name, and what can we learn from that name, and what maybe generalizations are we making about those names. But this brings in the possibility of the other ethnicities, and if we can find some of that in on death records, and some identity of what somebody at one point thought of the ethnicity of that individual, although that is often also wrong. So what do we know about the names of the people who are buried in this large, what is it? It's the 2,700. We think there's 2,700 burials. How many names do we have?
So of those records, there's actually way more names than we have unknowns. I was just looking at it, and as far as unknowns are concerned, and that's either just, they come up as like unidentified burial. And a number of them do actually have first names, but it's actually around 161 unknowns. The rest, there's some kind of first and last name, and then at least an internment date. And so part of what I've been working on more recently is I've been going name by name and plugging them into Ancestry. And so from there, depending on what I can find, sometimes I can find a lot. Sometimes I find death certificates, which are huge, because they give you so much information. Sometimes I get a lot of city directory listings. So you find out where people lived during certain years. And then also some of the federal census data, which is equally as important, because you find out who they live with and potentially their family members, even if sometimes that census data, as far as ages and things, can be off. And so typically what I do, if I find someone that it might be a potential match, I'll save any possibilities as well, just in case, there's some discrepancies as far as, this person has the same name, but they were born in 1880, and this person has the same name and was born in 1878. And so I save all that stuff. And it's a lengthy process, just trying to go through and try to do some kind of basic genealogy on up to 2,700, records. And I've managed to get through a couple hundred so far. But it's obviously that's a big piece of kind of the ongoing part. And obviously with these days, with it seems like every day or week there's more digital information being, you know, added. And so obviously this is kind of what we have now, and in the future there might be a lot more information that hopefully starts to become digitized. You know, but I think that that is a huge step as far as really starting to give some kind of life to these people. And before it was just, you know, there's people buried here, and now there's, you know, numbers, and now there's names, and now there's potential stories and where they lived and what they did. And so you know, I think I'm just happy to kind of to start seeing that, you know, because then you can actually tell people that these were people, you know, that we aren't just making up, you know, these names or numbers or anything like that. So that is kind of a big part of what the lengthy process is. But as far as the unknowns are concerned, roughly about 161 out of the 27 or so burial records. So
That's pretty interesting. So what I heard you say is that you spend all day going through rabbit trails. Down.
well, yeah, when I have time, and it's, you know, it can be tough just trying to devote the amount of time that probably is needed as far as how soon are we trying to have go through all those numbers. But you know, obviously, yeah, for me personally, I feel deeply invested in trying to do as much as I can, even if it takes me a lot longer than, you know, anticipated, because to me it wouldn't really be doing the job justice if you know, I didn't pass things off in the right way, you know. And so I feel pretty strongly of making sure that that I finish that part, so that, you know, whatever it is that I pass on, I've at least done it to, you know, the best of my ability to do so.
So the Texas Historical Commission had a project which they called RIP, and it was in 2000 to 2005, and they were looking for these cemeteries, and they were looking in county books. They were going to the county historical commissions, and they were looking for this information. And then when they couldn't find it, they just drew it a little circle on a map. Well, all those maps sat in the cemetery program for 20 years. And I came along and they said, get rid of all these maps. And I was like, oh no, I can't get rid of all these maps. They have this information on it. And so I started opening those rabbit trails again to see what was on the web. And of course, Find a Grave has come up, not that it's perfect, but I've got all of these other resources. And so it's just multiplying and multiplying and multiplying. But what I find fascinating about what you just said is that you're researching these things and they become real, and you think about them, and then you tell a story about them, because you know a part of a person who hasn't been dug up, their existence, their why was he living with this name, and what was that relationship, and let me drive to that place. I took pictures of the house that my great grandmother lived in Chicago from Google Earth, you know, like holy moly, my dad remembers her telling stories about that house, and I showed him a picture of that house. Like it makes it real. And that's where those stories, those tours that I thought were so gimmicky, it works. They're alive. They're living in your head. They're living in your stories. You're changing the way you do things or think, because now you have this person from 150 years ago hanging out, asking questions.
So I've got, this is just for my curiosity, how does copyright affect your ability to save information that you find on Ancestry and then make it available through your database?
I know, like, basically what our database actually just is just a spreadsheet of each of these records. And so it's not necessarily that we're embedding any of this stuff directly into that database, because this is basically a spreadsheet. Like what we do, what I can put in there is if I find, you know, an actual birth date or a death date. I am saving all of those documents to have them just in case. But as far as, you know, what they're gonna eventually embed and make public, I'm not actually sure. I guess hopefully maybe Jennifer has more answers to that. Yeah.
So I feel like the rules as technology evolves will also keep evolving. But what we try and do is cite everything.
Exactly.
We do not always reach out and get written permission unless the digital archive requires it. But if it is for non-commercial use, we cite it and we keep going. And if it's roughly in the public domain, which Find a Grave basically is, we still say we found it from Find a Grave, but then we use it and move on. So I expect to get called on the carpet a number of times by the city of Boston for doing a little too much. But like I said, ours is not a commercial use, it's educational. And I think when they did stuff, when you all worked on the cemetery master plan and vision plan, there's an idea about people who've been dead over so many decades, right? And if they're far in the past, they're part of just historical record. So there's not a level of permissioning or even finding descendants in a lot of cases. And we get calls and visitors a lot who don't have the tools or paid subscriptions to do their own genealogy work. And we do help them. We do not help everybody as equally as we would like, but we, especially for the people buried in this section, that is because of the history of the chapel itself. What I consider my main job is to understand the context of the chapel and do some justice to the people who are buried in its area. So we have put out a lot of calls for descendants and continue to get contacted. And we do like to help with genealogy. Not only is Greg working on it, but a lot of volunteers are too. So I envision this database as being very dimensional, both in terms of its 3D model and all the information we can start plugging into it as we find it. It's like a library for these people. And the filing place of that person is this section of the cemetery. And so there are lots of ideas of a digital twin of cities, of how they function and for future modeling and development. But what if we have the historical models built into a digital twin and we can actually see who we were and where we came from, literally back to when it was the native people who were here long before these colonial settlers, not even 200 years ago. So
thanks. I appreciate that. Greg, you answered my my question, I think, initially, because I had envisioned when you're talking about a database and you're finding all these resources, that those documents would then be embedded in the database. So I understand that, and certainly I wasn't suggesting that copyright is more important than telling these stories. I was just really more curious about whether you were having to deal with copyright issues in terms of being able to embed death certificates, for example. What I'm hearing is that that's not the intention right now. You've got them, you can share them, but you're not presenting them as, as your own database. So I
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because I think that's, because what you can gather from a death certificate obviously can be it's a lot of personal information. I know, I think kind of first and foremost, as we talk about trying to rebuild some kind of trust with the community, especially those descendants, is also like, if 10 years from now someone comes forward and it's like, I love what you've done on, my great-great-grandfather or so forth or whatever. But, you know, there's a lot of information that maybe I'm not comfortable, you know, publicly being out there, that we have to kind of put that kind of first and foremost, as far as, you know, what the family wants is kind of the most important part of that picture. I know as far as, you know, my family was concerned, as much as the legacy of kind of R.S. Lovingood was for a long time basically lost and forgotten about. And as much as I wanted to help, you know, my mother, who was doing a lot of the genealogy, and my grandfather, who barely knew anything about his grandfather, and attempting to try to get him included in the African American Museum in DC. There's also the part of me that was thinking about, you know, my family, these people that have been kind of at rest for so many decades. And the more that I, you know, talk about them and share their legacy, you know, for the majority, that's great and people learn. But then there's always that small bit of fear that there's always going to be that one person who doesn't like what they did, you know, doesn't like what they stood for. And there's always that fear that someone could, you know, do something to their place of rest, whether it's graffiti or defacing or something. And so I've had to battle with that, as far as like wanting to tell his legacy, but also like being aware that the more and more people know about him, there's always that chance that there's someone who just, you know, doesn't like the fact that this man was educated and owned land and did a lot of things, and that somehow, you know, would do something to their marker or the monument. And I mean, I think I would feel probably the most responsibility in that, because obviously I'm the one that's done the most. I mean, there's probably at least from RS's first son's lineage, there's at least 100 other of us kind of living descendants that can trace ourselves through to Reuben Shannon Lovingood. And so obviously it's been kind of a roller coaster, like I just said, just wanting people to know what he did, but also, you know, slightly being terrified that if someone did something, that it would be completely on me, for people who were, you know, have long been at rest and not wanting to disturb that rest. So I think with that being said, it's just super important that we're listening to these descendants when we have those meetings, and what they say, what they're comfortable with, because that is one way that we can start to try to rebuild, you know, that trust, in making sure that whatever they share with us, it's up to them exactly what they want to share. And if at some point they say, you know what, I feel like I shared too much, and now I'm worried that we have to be okay, we can take that down. Of course, it might be the complete opposite, where, as someone mentioned, that you might get more and more people that are interested in wanting to share and tell stories because of the way that we've conducted ourselves and kind of tried to reestablish that trust. And obviously, I think that's the hope, that as we proceed through this project in the future, people are seeing how we've preserved history and done justice to it, and want to come forward and tell those stories. So
I guess I think you're absolutely right. And I guess one kind of a fundamental question is, do you make sharing the default and restricting information based on, you know, a request from the family, or do you make restricting information the default, and you know, where you have to have affirmative consent as opposed to, you know, affirmative restrictions? I think that's a big policy decision, you know, probably to be made. And, you know, I'm working with a cemetery right now where, you know, there are 1 billion descendants, and they can't agree on anything. And I drove up to Dallas and they shared a whole bunch of information with me. And that night got mad at another descendant who is kind of leading the conservation of this cemetery, and decided that they didn't want anything to do with it. Well, tough nugs, I had already gotten them to sign all the permissions for all the stuff they shared with me. So too late, ladies. But, you know, I mean, I know that even, you know, I mean, literally it was within like 3 hours that they, you know, changed their minds about what they, you know, wanted to share. And, you know, at the end of the day, the most important thing they gave us was a hand-drawn map of where the markers had been in 1993, because a lot of them had been toppled and now we can put them back where they were. But it's just this ongoing, you know, delicate dance of, you know, how you address these situations as they arise. I think it would be, you know, helpful to make some kind of broader decisions about what your default policy is going to be here before you get too much farther down the road, because that's going to direct and influence what your interface is, you know, how you do present information, and how you collect information too, because if you want people to share with you, you need to be able to tell them, you know, how it's going to be used and how it will be presented and who's going to have access to it, and what's, you know, what their rights are in terms of potentially being able to restrict it. So anyway, I would just encourage you to, you know, continue to have, you know, all those really big picture conversations early and often as you go forward.
I wanted to make two comments. One is, Greg, I recognize what you're saying. I every time I map a cemetery that's been lost, I wonder who's going to see that location, what they're going to do to it, and what vulnerabilities I bring to making it public. And the other thing I wanted to say, which is on a different topic, is there's safety and generalizations. What are we saying about this population? What are we saying about this time period? What are we learning? This is kind of goes back to the original question, you know, what short story should be told? You know, I think at first you start with generalizations. What do we know about this group as a whole, and the time that they lived, and their quality of life, their existence, their contributions, but maybe not on a specific level, but a more a general level. And then maybe you kind of feel that out and see how, you know, can we go down this particular path of this family or this individual.
Well, we have about 5 minutes, and I just want to thank you for the rich conversation we've had, and the fact that the frameworks that you're providing for this conversation, while we started with my not knowing what it would be. Thank you, everybody, for who's asked some questions and have got us to deeper thoughts about this. But just want to open it up while we have these last few minutes. Want to be conscientious of your time that you spent with us this morning. If there's something that we want to have, any final thoughts, maybe that something we didn't touch on, or something that we might be missing, or anyone from the project team that wanted to add any comments.
I just wanted to say thanks for the opportunity to be here participating with this fantastic project team. I'm a big fan of all of you individually, and I'm very jealous of Greg and all his research, which I would love to be able to do just endlessly. But I really appreciate that that you all invited me to participate in this, and if I could be of service in any way, I certainly welcome the opportunity.
I did not know what to expect or who the specialist would be today, and so thank you for inviting me. And it's always nice to see familiar faces and be a part of a group project.
Steph, you're at Middle Tennessee, so you know Martha Norkunis.
Martha is the only faculty member who has refused to have me in any of her classes
Okay.
because she opposed my admission as a remote student.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
I'm sorry to
so-
hear that.
Yeah.
Wow.
But
That's
I
a
guess I do
really
know
great
her.
public history program. So, glad you're in there, and continued success. And
Thanks.
Jenny, great to have you at the THC. You're doing great work over there. I hear about it all the time. So it's been really good to hear from both of you guys. But yeah.
And Dr. Franklin, if I ever have the opportunity to work with you on anything, please let me know because I would jump at the chance.
Oh, gosh. Okay. You shouldn't have said that because never do that.
I'm
No,
absolutely
that's awesome.
serious.
That's
I'm
great.
absolutely
I
serious.
appreciate
Yeah.
that. So I'll find out your contact information.
Yeah, please keep me in mind, and that applies to everybody. I'm already thinking of like, what can I cook up that can allow me to work with Diana on something. And just like, I've just about reeled in Dr. Dudley on a project that we just talked about this morning. So, I cast a wide net myself. But thank you very much. And
I just answered the
Laura,
phone.
thanks for inviting me to do this.
No, Jenny and Steph, your insight this morning has been incredible and just got me thinking more deeply about this particular project and a number of other things that I'm working on and what my responsibility should and should not be on a professional level, on a personal level, no matter which hat or lens that I'm approaching projects. So this has been really, really helpful and insightful. And as much as you were, enjoying the opportunity to work and converse with us, right back at you, because you guys are rock stars and we appreciate this tremendously. I've been very quiet because there are a number of things going on in the periphery this morning, but this has been a great conversation.
I just wanted to do a real quick mention also. Rhonda Robinson Thomas just published last fall a really fantastic book called Call My Name Clemson that I found to be so helpful in terms of how I think about naming people and bringing attention to individuals. She focused on African-American people who built Clemson while they were enslaved, and the difficulties that she's had getting the university to acknowledge that. But it's a lot about her research, and I just found it to be immediately applicable to the work that I'm trying to do. And so I just wanted to mention that because it is pretty new, that I think it just is holistically is a really great summary of her process and how she approached that. So I just wanted to mention that real quickly.
So the interesting thing about Clemson, so R.S. Lovingood, originally where he's from is from South Carolina, just right in the kind of the valleys close to the Blue Ridge Mountains. And obviously Lovingood was the slave name that they were given, which was originally German. And I think it was actually like Liebengut was the original translation or original name. So yeah,
he might be in her database.
Okay, well, with that said, thank you again for answering our call. We enjoyed this time with you, and we will stay in touch if there's anything else. And then for the project team, we're just going to stay on for a couple of minutes. But thank you. You guys have a great weekend.
Thanks, everyone.
thank you.
Okay, bye.